You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Welcome back to this week's edition of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. In this week's radio show, I'll be interviewing Paul Angel. Paul, the editor-in-chief, the executive editor of the Barnes Review, which is the TBR in TBR Radio Presents. And when we interviewed Paul back in March, it was to talk about what was then the recently released March-April issue of TBR Magazine, or the Barnes Review Magazine. And so now the May-June issue has come out, and I'm going to interview Paul again, and we're just going to go through the magazine article by article, page by page, and we're just going to talk about what's in the magazine. And the reason we're doing this, once again, is because the Barnes Review is a magazine that if you're not already reading it, you need to be. I just want to put this information out there for you. You can find out what's in the Barnes Review. I know as you listen to Paul and I talk about it that you'll want to read this issue. Hopefully you'll want to subscribe to the Barnes Review if you're not already a subscriber. At the very least, maybe we'll whet your appetite enough that you'll buy the individual copy of the magazine just to read some of the articles that we talk about. Again, let me just say it, the Barnes Review is a great magazine. I write for the Barnes Review. In fact, in this issue, we start my first of a three-part series of articles on secession. And this particular article is titled Secession and the Law of God. And I explain that secession is not only constitutional, but it's also biblical. That secession was the remedy that God gave his people back in the Old Testament so that his people could be freed from the suppression and the tyranny of oppressive government. But this was just a great issue of the Barnes Review. There's a lot of good stuff in there. There's an article on the assassination of Robert Ford. Of course, we all know the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. But what we did not know was that the person who allegedly shot Jesse James, Robert Ford, was himself assassinated by a Yankee who was avenging the death of Jesse James. Interesting twist of history. We'll talk about that later in the program. We'll talk about who started World War I. We'll talk about some interesting information that has come to light recently as we're now going into the 50th anniversary of the assassinations of Robert F. or R.F. Kennedy, RFK, and Martin Luther King, or MLK. We'll be talking about the crucifixion of old Russia. Basically how the communists, when they took over Russia, the early Soviets, how their goal was to eradicate Christianity in their country. And of course, we talk about the Jewish Holocaust of World War II. But one thing that you do not hear near as much about is the Christian Holocaust of Russia. Stalin committed a far larger Holocaust than Hitler did. The number of Christians that were murdered by Stalin, that were holocausted by Stalin, some historians say that number is between 20 and 60 million. Stalin himself admitted to 10 million and even bragged about it. So the Holocaust of Christians that was perpetrated by the Soviets was even greater than the Holocaust of Jews that was perpetrated by the Nazis. But it's something that you don't see written about a lot, talked about a lot. You're not seeing a lot of documentaries about it, but it was covered in this issue of the Barnes Review. Paul Angel and I, the editor of the Barnes Review, will talk about it at length. We'll be talking about some of the other great articles that were in the Barnes Review as well. And so let me just take us now straight into our interview with Paul Angel. Here we begin. The first page of the Barnes Review, pretty much after the table of contents and all that, is a little brief article about Herbert Hoover. And then later in the magazine, toward the end of it, there's an even longer, lengthier piece about Hoover. And so we start our conversation talking about Herbert Hoover. Hoover's always been a fascination of myself. Have you ever read Herbert Hoover's magnus opus? He called it his magnus opus. It was really his autobiography / his explanation of how he had attempted to save America from the Depression before FDR did, and basically explaining how FDR, forced the United States into World War II when himself and others were doing everything that they could to keep us out of a war.
Well, it's a perfect example, right? Herbert Hoover is always coming up really low on the lists of great presidents, right? I mean, he's not even listed as great president. He's listed as one of the worst presidents in history. And I think that article in this particular issue kind of tried to give you a fair history of Hoover. FDR has become, what is FDR listed as one of the top presidents of all time, and not the greatest, right? He lifted us out of the Depression. He was personally victorious, wheeling his wheelchair in front of the onrushing troops at D-Day, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
And poor old Herbert Hoover gets called the worst one. Of course, you got Hoovervilles and everything else. But it turns out, listen, I've always wondered sometimes, are the economic booms and busts from that occur during a president's tenure, sometimes I say, how long does it take for something to really kick in? Is this the work of the previous president? Is this the work of this president? Is it possible to turn around a country in a year or 2 years? What is it that's working, what's not? So I imagine that Hoover, who always argued that he had done so many things to try to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression. And I think he felt that Roosevelt was reaping the benefits of some of his own policies. But it didn't stop. Of course, you had to lionize Roosevelt because if he wasn't a great hero, and Churchill wasn't a great hero, and Hitler wasn't the great demon, and Mussolini weren't the great demons that we thought in the Japanese Empire, then what were we fighting for? So to me, this is all these reviews of the presidents when they're not really looking at the facts. And I think this new book that this was being reviewed on Hoover was called Hoover: Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times. I mean, his life was defined as the president, but man, the things he did when he wasn't president were pretty amazing too, right? One of the greatest humanitarians in American history. But if they don't want him to be a hero and they want him to be a bad guy, that's what he's going to be, and that's what you're going to hear. And so it was interesting in this particular issue that I think it was S.T. Patrick, right, a new writer that we have, had read the book on Hoover and felt it was time for a little reclamation of Hoover's true history. You got to read the story in the May-June issue, the Barnes Review, to get the full story. And then you got to read the book. The book itself, talking about Hoover's magnum opus. This book was, I think, 750 pages. I thought it was pretty well done. And I think it's something that everybody ought to look at just to get an idea of what the Barnes Review and other organizations are like this are saying about people in American history and how misled people have been. But what did you come across when you read Hoover's book? How did you feel about him? What's your personal opinion on Hoover?
Let me just say that reading Hoover's book totally changed my perception of World War II and what had actually happened.
How so?
Hoover actually begins before World War II, and he basically explains how certain interests within the United States basically financed and built up the Bolshevik Revolution, and he basically laid communism, as the world knew it during his lifetime, at the feet of the bankers, the Democrat Party, certain members of Congress.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, then interesting tie-in article to that would be our continuing series, of course, being 2018. 100 years ago, the world was racked in war. It was coming to an end, I suppose, or getting there. This bloody carnage called World War I. And a new book it's been released. We can't get copies of the book. It's taken forever to print it. But it was called Hidden History, A Secret History of World War I. And so in that same issue, an article by Mark Rowland called Who Really Started World War I. This was part 2 of this series on this book, in which they follow all the secret deals and the armaments makers and the bankers and how they're working both sides, and their lobbying groups are pushing these people to go to war, push for no good reason. And it is a statement, too, as far as World War I and then World War II, how the bankers and the industrialists drive these wars so many times without any kind of concern for the carnage that they're going to inflict upon humanity. World War I, just an amazingly stupid war. And if you read the article there, I think you'll get the idea that there haven't been too many wars we've been in since the Revolutionary War that have been for our best interest and not for the interest of the bankers. We're selling a book, too, that relates to the War of 1812 and the Rothschilds. We've got one about same thing, book coming through. Another banking book you'll find in our banking section of our website at www.barnesreview.org. about how the Rothschilds were integrally involved in punishing us for standing up to the banking conglomerate during the War of 1812, pretty much caused the War of 1812, and how the Rothschilds and their minions were integrally involved also in attempted assassination against one of the many plots against Lincoln, et cetera, et cetera.
You talk about the bankers and the War of 1812, or the bankers and the war between the states, the bankers, the assassination attempts on Andrew Jackson, the bankers, the assassination attempt on Abraham Lincoln. It seems like as we look at history, it's the same script, just different characters, different actors.
It's funny, Ed, we had an article in the American Free Press just recently talking about young people today. Young people today, they'll protest against anything. Save the polar bear, save the whales, save the snail darter, But bankers are bad, everybody's bad. One thing they don't seem to be coming out is against war. And so one of the focuses has always been for good nationalists. Anyway, nationalists get this reputation as warmongers. But we're the ones who are constantly fighting to expose the truth about war, expose the waste of life and money of all races and all people. Just that they don't care what color you are, what religion you are. They just want you to fight and die and buy a new gun for the next guy who comes in line to get his butt shot down. But yeah, so there's that constant theme is run through everything we do. Don't trust the government. Don't overly trust them. I guess you can trust them once in a while. They haven't proven it so. And that you must keep your eyes open for these false flags that draw us into war. And the most recent one being this chemical attack on Syria. And there's also this myth, I think it's not necessarily a false flag, but a myth that Iran is ready to drop the bomb on everybody, and that we want to scrap this nuclear agreement with Iran. And this is just, why are they constantly agitating towards war? It's the stupidest thing human beings have ever done. And unfortunately, we've been doing it to each other for the last 50,000 years. So,
well, I can't figure it out for the life of me, because it became painfully obvious to me probably around 2002. George W. Bush's troop movements in the Middle East were going to put us at war with Iran. I mean, I'm honestly surprised we haven't already had that war.
Well, the Iranians have been, and so they're completely against what you hear, but I feel like the Iranians have been extremely patient. It isn't they who have been invading countries over the past 20 years. I don't think they've invaded anybody. I don't think they started the Iran-Iraq war, not sure, but I know that there was fighting along the border there, but they certainly haven't gone out of the way to invade anybody, slaughter anybody, kill anybody, drop bombs on anybody in great numbers that I know of, as opposed to the Anglo-American triumvirate that seems to lead with a boot instead of an open hand. I mean, listen, diplomacy can go a long way. We're agitating everywhere now. Agitating in Ukraine and against the Russians everywhere. Here was this guy, was it Pompeo, and the other, one of his other appointees recently, maybe it was, I don't think it was his chief of staff, maybe it was, whatever it was talking about retaliating in Syria and targeting Russian troops and Iranian troops. Man, I mean, what are they trying to do? You have to ask yourself, who are the advisors to the presidents who are pushing for war? And you have to say, does religion matter? Well, at some point in time it does. If the people who are advising the president are, say, end times believers in the apocalypse or the Armageddon, and they're looking at this from an angle we're not. Maybe they think they're fulfilling biblical prophecy, for all I know. On either side, it could be Old Testament, could be New Testament, whatever it may be.
Well, do you want to hear a scary story?
Sure.
And this was, maybe 12 years ago. Jack Van Impe told me that George W. Bush or Condoleezza Rice, one of those two, would call him every week. And they would run by intelligence reports as well as potential military and diplomatic strategies, because they wanted to know how their actions would either trigger or go along with Bible prophecy.
Yeah, it's a scary thing. And then so I've asked one of our writers to kind of look into this. I mean, we know who the big Svengali was for Wilson, right? It was Colonel House. Don't know what he believed, if he was super religious. He was Jewish, I believe. And don't know what his particular beliefs were. You had strange advisors around FDR. You had even poor old Ronald Reagan, right, was at one point in time getting involved with astrologists and tarot card readers. And it's a question. Who's advising these people? What are their ultimate goals? And what's the profit? I always say people in the United States haven't really had war brought to their homeland. We had 9/11, and we've had some occasional acts of terror, whether it be false flag or not. You wonder what's real and what's not as far as what they're inflicting upon us and what their ultimate goal is. Do we think that we could lose a war? Well, most people in the United States don't even think it's possible that we could lose a war. Well, if we ever get involved in a nuclear war, I imagine there's no winners. But I always imagine that in the future, all these plans and everything that the Chinese have stolen from us, we shoot off all our nuclear missiles, and they're disarmed electronically as they go over the enemy airspace, we'll say. And of course, their rockets come over here because we haven't really done a very good job in making sure we're the most up to date and whatever. Massive amounts of money we spend, but it seems like the U.S. Defense and really the War Department hasn't really been using their money properly. They got massive budgets, but I guess it just means we got really great wrenches and toilet seats. But whatever it may be, that particular issue of the Barnes Review started off with a review kind of. We hear all this stuff now. Hollywood stars are so big and powerful nowadays, and they think everybody wants to know what they think. They're traditionally liberal. They're donating millions to the Southern Poverty Law Center to fight hate, and the Anti-Defamation League and these other groups that are, in many respects, according to most people, the real hate groups for putting groups like the Barnes Review on match lists and watch lists and hate lists and whatever list you have. But this was about Leni Riefenstahl. And so as you see Hollywood giving out their great awards for the wonderful movies that they allegedly make nowadays, most of which seem to be computer-generated movies about superheroes, right? Yeah. That seems to be the base. It all seems so meaningless what they're putting out.
And they're not even new movies. They're remakes of movies that we were watching when we were kids.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I like Buck Rogers better with a tin can and a string. It looked just almost as good as today. No, I'm just kidding. But this was about Leni Riefenstahl. Of course, Riefenstahl was always known as Hitler's filmmaker. But the woman was more than that. She was an actress. She was extremely intelligent. She was worried and interested in about the futures of multiple numbers of ethnic groups, including some of the African tribes. And she photographed later in life. She was blackballed herself. Probably never got the credit she deserved for the brilliant filmmaker she was, although Triumph of the Will has been lauded for many years as one of the greatest documentaries, political documentaries of all time. But that particular issue, May June, did lead off with a nice kind of retrospective on her career. And it was kind of surprising to see how, for me, most people know this, the number of works of cinematography that she put together, but also the trials and tribulations she faced after World War II, appearing before the denazification trial tribunals. And that was 7 years after World War II. I think it was 1952. So they were still hounding, and they're still hounding these people today. Riefenstahl died, I think, at a pretty old age, right? At 97, I think she died, 97 years old. Still not getting the credit she deserved. And still, I think people ought to look into her and probably check out some of the movies she was making and the movies she starred in, as opposed to some of the stuff they're cranking out of Hollywood, which is really trash. It's funny, though. Of course, they get the plaudits, and she gets the smearing. So just another kind of a story that you'll find in the Barnes Review that tries to bring history in accord with the facts.
Well, if you think about it, you look at Walt Disney's films in the 1940s, and they were all propaganda films for the Allies. You look at his cartoon, Donald Duck cartoons even. They were just... You can't watch them and not say this is pure propaganda.
Well, especially when he's dressed up like a World War I soldier, a German, Donald Duck, right? And he's whacking Mickey on the head, and Mickey's the president or whatever it may be. Which, people don't even realize that.
Yeah, so had the war turned out the other way, Leni could have been the great filmmaker who owned the amusement park, and, Walt could have been the
war criminal. Yeah, that's right. That's correct. What did American officers say at Nuremberg? There's nothing that they've done that we haven't done, and they were a lot of them were just disgusted with the Nuremberg trials, which we did cover. I wouldn't say at length, but it was a good mix of stuff on Nuremberg and some of the war crimes trials in the March-April issue. People ought to go to the website, because when you subscribe nowadays and get the print edition, you also get the PDF edition. And so coming along with this PDF edition, which you can print out at home. It saves you $20 a month. I think it's $36 a month for the PDF edition and $56 to get both the PDF and the print. But we've got, I think we have all the way back now. We've gone year to year slowly. That the archives you get with that will take you back to 2008 or 2007, and those archives keep getting bigger. And we've got all kinds of topics that you can look through the indices in the back of the issues to find out what we have said about Walt Disney and others. I think Walt Disney, actually, Willis Carto, the founder of the magazine, was a big fan of Walt Disney, considered him an American hero. But one day I was looking at Dr. Seuss. Of course, Dr. Seuss is like, they have Dr. Seuss night, right, at the elementary school nowadays for all across the country. And it's like Seuss week, And I think his real name was Theodore Geisel. But have you ever seen his World War II cartoons?
No, I haven't.
Oh, my gosh. He would definitely not. If you put those out today, he would be called a complete utter racist, and any statue of him would be torn down, right? Because they have the pictures of the Japanese coming over, and they have the huge buck teeth and the overly slanted eyes, and they're all evil, you know what I'm saying? But it's total racist stuff. And it's funny how the heroes sometimes are one small twist in history, and the hero is the GOAT, that's for sure. But talking about Trump earlier, I also had Matt Johnson do an article for us in this issue on the parallels, because people are talking about this all the time nowadays, the parallels between Donald Trump's administration thus far and Richard Nixon. And both of them had both made vows to kind of, well, Nixon didn't use the terminology, but they were both kind of leery of, suspicious of, and condemned the deep state, right? And Nixon was going to bring him to heel, I guess. And nowadays, of course, the closest thing we have is Donald Trump. And both of them were getting the same treatment. And so there's an article there that I thought was pretty interesting about the multiple numbers of fake news stories and how the news media have jumped on board to smear Trump. And sometimes he deserves it, and most times he doesn't. He's just Donald Trump, for gosh sakes. But anyway, I thought it was interesting, the enlistment, the involvement of the Post, right? This came out at the same time this new movie about the Post came out. What heroes they were. Woodward and Bernstein and old Katharine Graham up there, the old the dragon lady who was portrayed in the movie. I think it's kind of being out of touch, or maybe that's the way she was portrayed by her employees. I can't remember. That was a good story about how none of this stuff is new that we're seeing either. I mean, history, this is why it's so important for people to know history and to figure out where they've lied to us in the past and what media they've used to do it. I'll tell you, I'm going to mention something in a minute here that's kind of scary, and you're going to tell me what you know about, because I know you've done more research on it than I have. But when we publish this stuff about war, and we publish this stuff about who or may not have been the true culprits and what religion they were or what race they were, whether they be white, Christians or not, it doesn't really matter to us, because we will condemn a criminal when we see a criminal. But this new law coming out in South Carolina, which I want you to inform our listeners a little bit about, at least in this particular show, you may have done it in other shows, how dangerous this is. And if they don't know about it, tell us something about this legislation that's happening in South Carolina and why that really affects the very future of the Barnes Review.
I'm not exactly for sure the scope of this legislation right now. I think it may only be applicable to the Department of Education in the state of South Carolina.
Correct. It's college campuses, mostly in schools, right?
Yes, but still the precedent that it sets is scary. And, basically any criticism of the governmental state of Israel, in other words, that little country, that exists off the coast of the Mediterranean that calls itself Israel, and I'm not saying that it's not Israel and that it's not a sovereign state. I guess what I'm trying to do, and I'm fumbling for the words to do it with, is I guess I'm trying to distinguish between Israel as what we think of as the biblical nation and Israel as the current geopolitical state in that part of the world today, and they're not one and the same. But anyways.
Well, as far as the legislation goes, you know who they're talking about.
Yeah. But basically any criticism of Israel would be considered anti-Semitic and would be a violation of state law and would be a felony. And that's just scary. It's a total. I guess the First Amendment just doesn't apply in that situation.
Well, and I think it is on public schools and college campuses, but there was some verbiage in there that was even more scary because of it was a little larger scope. At first, when I thought about it, it was a no criticism of Israel bill. But they also said that, I thought, that any purveying of these old myths about a world Jewish conspiracy, Jewish control of the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions, I'm reading a quote from that, would be considered anti-Semitic behavior that was making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews in particular, as such, or the power of Jews as a collective. Okay, look, man, we talk about everybody. Okay, so we talk about the Muslim slave trade. We talk about Jewish involvement in maybe the ownership of the boats. We talk about what white Southerners were and what weren't, what's presidents owned. We don't care who it is. But all of a sudden now our ability to dialogue, to discuss from one brain to the next, we'll say, open mind, there is no more discussion. They're telling us what we can and can't talk about. So that would mean, for our purposes, from what I can understand, that Barnes Review would be illegal on a college campus if, in fact, in one of those issues, we were discussing a great number of Jews were in the upper echelon of the Soviet government during the time of the slaughter of the genocide of the 60 million Christians. Okay, all of a sudden it becomes like identifying the criminal, as they do now, right, on the news. He's 6 foot tall and he has a suit on and black shoes. I know no more about that. Could be any number of people, but when you're restricted in your ability to discuss these in full scope, it seems as though you're going to have a harder time getting to the truth about this. It's a little bit scary. Can a kid who walks on campus with the Barnes Review be arrested? Right? And your prediction was that this type of legislation will seep its way state by state across the nation.
Right, because it's a general legislative pattern. You'll notice that whenever one state passes a law within the next 2 to 3 years, the same laws will be passed in just about all of the other states in one variety or another.
Right, and so here, according to the article in American Free Press, this particular bill languished for over a year until the South Carolina Senate approved it by a 37-4 vote, utilizing a parliamentary maneuver to ram it through. The senators used the state's $8 billion budget to give new life to two stalled bills that define anti-Semitism and require the state to certify local governments are enforcing federal immigration laws and not creating so-called sanctuary cities.
Well, this is a question that I have about that law. This requires more research. But I know at the federal level that you can pass a law by basically burying it in the budget. But when you do that, that law is only effective, it's only on the book during the budget year of the budget that you inserted it into. And so I'm wondering in South Carolina if this law will be permanent or if it will only be in effect during this upcoming budget year, or if it's one of those situations where it will only be in effect in this upcoming budget year, but no one will realize that it lapsed, and so its enforcement will continue even though it will no longer have the force of law behind it.
Well, that is sufficiently confusing for me to believe that that's probably their plan. Because who the heck is going to know that? But it is a scary thing. What's next? You know, things don't end with one, just like one state will domino here as far as passing laws like this. Will they insist that other groups be added to this until there are literally, you're unable to have a discourse with a positive or a negative? I guess if you make a positive comment about it, it's all fine. But if you make any negative comment about anybody, it's considered hate. Now you're getting to the point where you're trying to tell me what I should be able to think and what I can't think, and completely devoid of hate. You know, I just want to know what's going on. And if I find out that there's an interesting angle on something we're being told, we publish it. It's not like we're trying to get people to attack synagogues or anything, or mosques or whatever it may be. But anyway, listen, it's a scary thing. And that can wrap it up for that. I think people ought to keep their eyeballs on that particular legislation and see where this goes.
Well, let's go ahead and pause there, and we'll have a word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. We've kind of been talking about religion. There was an article in there on the crucifixion of old Russia.
That was a good one. This is of course, the royal family. The Romanovs were killed in 2018. They were taken out of power in 1918. They were taken out of power in 1917 and then held prisoner for a while. Mike Walsh has been on this particular topic, and he just talked about the attempt to wipe out Christianity in general, how disrespectful the Soviets were. They went into the churches, they took everything of value out of them, sold it. Really, I remember Lenin at one point in time had stolen billions, possibly in today's amount of money, works of art, gold, everything. Just took everything that the upper classes had. They show the pictures, and Mike Walsh is the author, and he does lots of photographs. So we have some great photographs of Russian troops taking out icons and pillars and shooting up the icons of Mary and Jesus in there, looting the places, tearing up the church bells, melting them down to do whatever they did with it. And it was a widespread, even as late as 1964, I think they were blowing up churches. And so that's a very good article, especially on the verge of this. Is this, and so here I'm not sure we've even said anything necessarily negative as far as that South Carolina rule goes, but the very fact that we'll name the names, and if the names are Christian, they're Christian. If they're not, they're not. If they're Jewish, they're Jewish. It's not the truth isn't hateful. The truth is the truth. So I'm wondering if an article like this could be published in the future and disseminated in South Carolina. People in South Carolina need to get up and say something about that law, by the way. That's one I don't want to go too much detail on. A lot of great pictures, great author. Mike Walsh has written 25 or 35 books, I think. We also, the following article is just about Salvador Borrego. Not many people have heard of him. He was a Mexican revisionist who died at a ripe old age. I think it was 102. And he has said the same things we're talking about, wars, for his whole career, and why he was blacklisted and why you probably never heard too much. He was a popular newspaper columnist, I believe, back at the time when Trotsky was living in Mexico. As a matter of fact, he was reading one of Borrego's paper when he was killed with the ice pick killer, right? And so here's just another guy who very few people is extremely important in the world of revisionism. He had some radically truthful ideas. And here's a guy that dedicated his life to uncovering the truth about war in Mexico. Specifically, he was interested in European angles on this whole stuff, and how even his writings would be. A guy is educated and as erudite as this guy, is a great writer, would be banned. You can't find, if you look him online, you might find him. I noticed that, by the way, that he was a good friend of Joaquin Bachaca, who was like one of the greatest Spanish revisionists. He's old now. This guy was actually Mexican, so he's from Spain, Bachaca. And I looked up Bachaca. We must have 40 articles on Bachaca written by Bachaca, and wanted an interview with him. I look at online, you can't find a mention, not even our own website does the stuff come up the way they have manipulated the algorithms for searches for certain names and people now. So don't even believe that the South Carolina law isn't really in force in some respects as far as dictating what you can and can't see. Borrego is a perfect example. Everybody ought to read his works. I don't know how many of them have been translated into English. Unfortunately, we'd love to do that, as a matter of fact, and see if we can. But it's not bad enough. Like half the guys, or a quarter of the guys on my editorial board, right, have already spent time in prison in Germany. And now we're talking about maybe they can spend some time in prison here in the United States if they talk about the wrong stuff. We also had 2 articles by Pat Shannon. Are you familiar with the work of Pat Shannon, or familiar with Pat?
I'm just starting to become familiar with his work.
Well, he's a long-time conspiracy theorist, I'll call him, but he's a truth teller as he sees it. And he has had a lot of contacts over the years. He's written a couple really good books. One of them is sold at probably by American Free Press and the Barnes Review. Everything they ever told me was a lie. And it talked about many of the great conspiracies through American history, specifically assassinations, the money scam, who killed MLK, who killed JFK, who killed RFK, did we get to the moon? That type of stuff. It's the moon issue is a very divisive one there, but I think everybody now can agree that there was more than one person involved in the killing of Kennedy. There was a lot of other people. Now, I don't know who shot the shot. They always have a program on television coming up. But anyway, in this particular issue, Pat goes in, since we're at a lot of anniversaries now, right? We got the 100-year anniversary of the Bolshevik takeover. We got the 100-year anniversary of the end of World War I. We have the 100-year anniversary of the slaughter of the Romanovs family. By the way, Mike Walsh is doing something for the July-August issue on this, then tracking down and slaughter of every remaining Romanov or royal family member they could get their hands on for the next several years. And it's also the 1968 was well, 63 was Kennedy, so that's going to give us what is that, 1963, 37, and 18. So what is that, 50, 45, 15? Don't count on me being a mathematician. But it also happens to be the anniversary of 1968 when we saw King get killed and Bobby Kennedy get killed. This particular issue, Pat had an article on both and what he knows, and Sirhan and James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray is interesting. People will always remember him as the man who shot Martin Luther King, but they're not going to remember him as the guy whose the ballistic test showed that it wasn't the gun he was convicted for that did the killing. So who was it? And there's a lot of interesting things in this. I mean, I guess I should have known this, but I didn't know the FBI was so interested in Martin Luther King that they had written in the letter, Hoover had written him a letter telling him to kill himself, or he was going to expose the philandering that they caught King in and the bugging of his offices and his quotes. And they even got him to go to the Lorraine Motel there in Memphis because they had said publicized bogus news stories, or maybe they were real, but whatever they did, they used it to pressure him that he'd been staying in fancy white hotels and not staying in the hotels in the neighborhood, knowing that this particular motel had poor was not good for his security, et cetera, et cetera. So Pat goes into both of those since they are anniversary-related deaths on the shooting of MLK and the shooting of RFK. RFK has always been interesting because multiple numbers of people heard way more shots than could have been fired from the one gun that Sirhan used to allegedly kill him, but also the mind control.
Well, Sirhan has always alleged and insisted upon his innocence, which is unusual for these high-profile events. Usually, the gunmen want to take credit for it. So,
well, that's correct, and of course, they got James Earl Ray to confess initially, right, and then he backed off the confession. And the thing you'll never hear in the media is that Coretta Scott King and Dexter King, the son and the wife, both supported James Earl Ray to try to get a new trial, because they knew something was funny about this whole assassination. So we have done it. The government, the deep state's been operating a long time, and it's just now getting that name. I don't know how long people have been calling the deep state, but it's a pretty good name, I think. The deep state's operating today against Trump, I think, when it has to, when it thinks it has to survive, to keep its budget going. And the deep state's probably not working as far back as, well, throughout history, but in our own country, the deep state was probably involved somehow in the American Revolution. I don't know, but it certainly was involved, according to the books we've sold, and involved in the War of 1812 and every other single war we've been in since then, in conjunction with the news media. Because obviously, without the news media putting up stories like Spanish terrorists bombed the Maine and getting people into a murderous frenzy, you can't support war. That kind of brings me back to where we were before and how the news media today seems to be even more involved than it ever was. And we know through Operation Mockingbird, right, that the news media was a willing repeater of bogus stories for the CIA and other U.S. intelligence. But how they have really been working on this today's generation to get them all fired up about every other thing. Man, what's more important? Did we tear down a few statues of Robert E. Lee that they're all out there for in the millions to protest against and want to pull down, or stopping another war where maybe 1 million Iranians can be killed? So it seems like even more they're just firing people up, ignoring the stories, putting out the fake news stories, keeping people distracted with this Trump stuff and this Russian collusion. It's funny. I think one of the Democrats saw a picture of Trump working with one of the North Koreans or a Korean to talk about peace, and what did they accuse him of? Now he's colluding with the North Koreans. So,
Yeah.
He's colluding for peace. Or how would you like to be trying to like dissect a nuclear weapon, right? Like Trump is kind of trying to diffuse the nuclear disaster that could happen, right? Or at least we think he is. I don't know what it is. Maybe he wants a war. And then behind you are people yelling, you're a crook, you're a criminal, Stormy Daniels, a sexist, racist, Charlottesville lover, even-handed guy, America First, crazy man. And here you are trying to disconnect those little wires and that A-bomb so it doesn't fly. Not too easy to do. But anyway, those were two interesting stories, just domestic stories. A lot of people know a lot about the Kennedy assassination, the RFK one, and MLK, but it's interesting. He brings a lot of points in here. And, of course, we had a story by you on Secession. And I think people would definitely want to read that if they're fans of Dixie Heritage, right, or Ed DeVries, because it's going to be a three-parter. Although you're always writing stuff that's even better. I always say, well, this one's even better than Secession. This one you just wrote recently on South Africa, for instance. And we could go into that, but then we'll hold that till that one runs. But what's happening around the world is just so much more important than pulling these statues down. That's just one example. They're doing all kinds of stuff like that, like the slaughter of the white South Africans. They right. The new law says they can take their property and not give them anything back, no remuneration, no compensation, and of course, slowly but surely, every 5 days, another South African farmer or farming family is slaughtered over there to the point where there won't be any left. And here, the United States government is denying these people asylum, right, on the grounds that they're being genocided. Well, I got news for you. There won't be any left to file for asylum in another 20 years.
Right.
So we think we've got, and of course, this someone has introduced, I don't remember who it was, but we're going to get on.
Well, the news media wouldn't even be reporting on it at all if it weren't for the fact that one of the recent victims just happened to have been a British citizen.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, yes, of course. If just a plain old white South African, they wouldn't even mention it. But we think that they ought to get on here. We're going to have an article in the AFP pretty soon, and then we'll probably run this article in TBR to try to get people on board to sign this petition to give these people fast-track asylum here before they're wiped out. And boy, they'd be perfect here, man. Come on. They'd be perfect here. And I live in rural Virginia, and we have thousands and thousands of acres of farmland for sale here, and nobody's doing anything with it. These white South African farmers would come right over here and probably get that land producing pretty quickly, make good citizens, start paying some taxes, not go around slaughtering each other. Of course, they don't like I don't think we're going to relocate them to Chicago. But if you could put a couple million of them in the bad areas of Chicago, maybe they could take care of business over there.
Have you ever been to Branson, Missouri?
No.
There's a theater there that's owned by a gentleman named Frederick Antonio. He's a pianist. The finale of his show is he plays two different songs on two different grand pianos at the same time.
Oh, that's amazing.
He's white, born and raised in South Africa, emigrated to the United States when he was probably in his 30s because his music career brought him here, became a U.S. citizen, and white gentleman speaks with kind of a Dutch-sounding accent, but that's always his joke, is that he's an African-American.
Yeah, and he is, too. Yeah. That's right. Well, listen, people of great skill of any race, I always say, we don't have a monopoly on everything as white people. We've done some good things, we've done some bad things, but so has everybody else. It's what human beings have done. And I feel like the thing that the news media does is focus on what divides us as Americans specifically, instead of what kind of unifies us. I'm not sure what unifies us anymore because they're trying to destroy any thread of culture that runs through us. It's like the idea of black people fighting for the KKK when it first started, or blacks fighting on the Confederate side. It's just they won't admit that we do have common cause on a lot of issues, and then we can work together. It doesn't mean we have to do it the New World Order way, which means we all have to marry first and then and then do it, or whatever, or have one of everything in our family, like the television commercials now. But yeah, man, if good Americans are good Americans, I think we're not on the right road necessarily now, but I don't give up hope for this country. But when I see them restricting our ability to discuss these things, to discuss these important topics, because they're so scared, they allege, that we might hurt somebody's feelings when in fact they're scared that people might learn the truth about how the news media and even the U.S. government, obviously state governments and everybody else are working to divide us all. That's what they're trying to stop. If people whose own states have laws like this, or they're considering laws like this, or even if you live in South Carolina, you need to call your congressman and tell him this is really stupid. It really is just stupid.
Well, I had a teacher friend of mine in South Carolina send me a meme the other day. And basically what it said is when something is so unquestionably true that we'll throw you in jail if you dare to ask questions about it.
For people who don't know what a meme is, right? Meme is an idea that spreads from person to person, but normally within your own culture, right?
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be some big phenomenon that you're talking about. I saw a guy, so I'm getting old myself, because I saw a guy that was when I was young, he was a young sportscaster, and now he went on there and he called it a meme. And I said he didn't know what he was talking about. But yeah, hey man, this is why the Barnes Review and why the programs you do and the articles you write and the radio shows that you host are so important, because it's really come quickly. We knew this was all coming. We just didn't know it would all snowball just because Hillary Clinton lost the election. I still say if Hillary had won the election, people say, oh my God, do you think how bad it would have been now? I don't even think they'd have worried about it.
Right.
Because they wouldn't have had so many people looking for an alternative to political establishment. So people, the Democratic Party is now known as the party of the minorities, and that's what they think they're going to have to the votes that they're going to have, and the segment of the population that they're going to need to control are the minority groups. So I say, watch out, minority groups, because you're just being re-enslaved by the same people that have been doing it forever. But I think
the whole welfare state, in LBJ's own words, was the establishment of a federal plantation.
Well, there you go. And I saw pretty funny. They're all up in arms because Kanye West is a popular black musician, right? Or a singer, right? That's what he does. He's a producer and all that. Pretty big, right? Pretty popular amongst many groups of people. The cartoon was the Democratic donkey standing in front of the plantation. It said Democratic plantation because they think they own the Hispanics and the blacks vote like people owned slaves back in the day. And of course, Kanye West is outside the plantation, and the Democratic donkey cartoon in front of the Democratic plantation is yelling, "We got us a runaway." And I'm thinking there ought to be a lot more people coming out and starting to voting what makes sense, not what gets them emotionally riled up, because that's what the Democrats are doing now. Everybody's against every minority group and the LGBTQ, right? Thinks that we all hate them. We don't. And so don't let anybody think that, don't let anybody tell you what I think about you. Ask me what I think about you, and I'll tell you what I think about you. And you may be surprised what I think about you. And you may be surprised at the honesty that we give people, because we're saying it with animosity. We're just saying what we believe. And so I don't know if there's ever going to be a blowback, though, Ed. I mean, things are just going like a steamroller.
Sometimes people are having victories in the culture war, but we're just afraid to report it because we're afraid of the consequences that it will bring on these people, or sometimes we don't want to draw attention to the victory.
Sometimes they're scared nowadays. Now, some people they're going to see these big old Confederate flags, for instance. I see one coming up 95. I guess it's still there, but it's on private property. But if you start to publicize it, then all of a sudden you talk about vandalism and personal attacks, and then go tracking down your employer, and then defacing your truck. I mean, there's a real physical and financial penalty to pay these days for speaking your mind. It's shameful, really. But this stuff, as I was saying earlier, it's steamrolling along. And so the question is, where does it stop? Will it stop? How does it stop? I hate to say this out in the public airwaves, but we may have the Barnes Review may be in several South Carolina college libraries. At one point in time, we had over 350 university libraries that were taking the Barnes Review. And so I hope that they would, how could they possibly justify removing something as well produced and as scholarly and as well thought through in the way it's presented as the Barnes Review from some inquiring mind? I don't care. I just want to get it out of there so they don't get in trouble.
On that thought, we'll pause for a word from the American Free Press. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. I know that we're running out of time, but there are two other articles in the issue that we haven't discussed yet. One of them was Who Started World War I. That was the last article in the issue.
That was only mentioned, in conjunction with its tie-in to the other one. That's the one we mentioned about the bankers and the industrialists and this new book coming out and exposing all these secret agreements and secret documents between the military-industrial complex or deep state and the U.S. government and the propaganda outlets.
And then, of course, we all know about the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. There was an interesting article in explaining how Jesse James's death was actually avenged by a Yankee who killed Robert Ford.
That's interesting. Listen, Jesse James has always elicited an interesting response. People love to hear about this guy. Few people know, right? He was a Confederate militiaman, right?
Well, do you know that of all of the people in history, Jesus has had more newsprint, more book print, more media exposure, more words published about him, more books published about him, more newspaper articles, magazine articles. He has received more press than anybody in the history of the world. But Jesse James is a very close number two.
No kidding. Well, listen, Clint Lacey is a native of Missouri, and he's very interested in Missouri history. As a matter of fact, many people, and we've run articles ourselves, as you say, that on a different vein maybe, but that Jesse James wasn't killed at all, right? That he faked his own death. And in this particular one, though, we do know that the man who shot or allegedly shot Jesse James, everybody thought that he shot Jesse and this guy wanted revenge. I didn't know he was a Northerner. But it's also the kind of smaller story that you're going to find in there in every issue of the Barnes Review that may not have the gravitas of ones about, say, the Holocaust or the ultimate win or loss of World War I or II, but are just fascinating little pieces of history. And then there's also in that particular issue just the advertising, and some of the color advertising was quite interesting. There's a book we just got, and I'm very interested in this subject, Spirits in Stone, explaining the megalithic landscape of New York and who built these megaliths up there. There's always a little something for everybody. Our next issue for July, August, of course, Harry Elmer Barnes, the man that the magazine was named after, died in 1968 as well. It's like we got lots of anniversaries coming up. He died in August of 1968, and he was a revisionist giant, and he's the one who really, I feel like, started the revisionist ball rolling. Everybody's like, what is revisionism? What is it really? It's going back to the event itself, looking at the primary sources and divesting yourself of the emotion and the war propaganda that happens, or the government propaganda that happens in most of these issues. So I think people will enjoy checking out the July-August issue as well, and learn a little bit more about Harry Elmer Barnes. There's not too much more I want to say there at this particular point in time. Any stories we didn't cover, man, they're going to have to buy the issue, and they can buy the issue for like $10, or they subscribe for a year for $56. Like I said, you get the PDF edition as well as the print edition, which is like, I don't know, what do we got there? 10 years, 60 more issues free for you if you haven't ever subscribed before, to access online, to be able to print out, to be able to read on whatever device you want to read it on. And just go to www.barnesreview.org and subscribe and support the Barnes Review. May not agree with everything you see in every single issue, but you will come away understanding why Ed DeVries submits to the Barnes Review, why he does what he does, why I do what I do, why the people I work with risk what they risk for the spirit of freedom of speech and honest history. So, hey, man, you don't have to agree with everything, but I'm telling you, I've had people tell me that reading the Barnes Review has changed their lives. They continue to read issue after issue, and because they find it one of the few last remaining uncensored history magazines available out there today. It certainly isn't like Smithsonian or National Geographic, although it's probably as beautiful as the two of those, right?
Yeah. You know what amazes me, even with my Secession article, the artwork, that you found to accompany that.
That guy is a genius, isn't he?
Yeah.
Listen, I'll tell you, your stuff's great, Ed. I have a feeling that fans of yours know that you could probably put an issue of that out every 2 weeks. The way that, as prolific as you are and the amount of material you give me, all extremely well written. It's been a real pleasure working with you so far. Let's keep it all going as long as we can.
Well, I'm definitely enjoying it and hope to do that myself. One book that I've been reading here recently, and I'm just about finished with it now, and it was one of the TBR books, was The Suppressed History of American Banking.
Yes.
It's just amazing the quality of not just the magazine, but the books that are, available from the Barnes Review. Sometimes they're advertised in the magazine, sometimes they're advertised on the website. Just the quality of these books is just mind-blowing.
Well, I tell you, like I said, Willis Carto, the guy who started the Barnes Review in 1994, passed away in 2015, had high standards. And luckily, I was trained as a graphic designer, and I've been able to not only combine graphic design for the past, I started working back in the Spotlight in 93. So I guess this is my 25th anniversary of working, another anniversary. And I've been able to use those skills and the training that I had to do something important, to change the life once in a while. And if they're so interested in us, in what we're doing, another show will have to go over the recent FOIA release, Freedom of Information Act releases on Willis and the Spotlight. You'll be surprised, maybe even yourself, just how infatuated the FBI and the U.S. government was in the work Willis was doing and still are interested in today. We just had one of the releases said that we couldn't get, there was a special exemption for the Spotlight and American Free Press because it's still an ongoing investigation. So it's for the same thing kind of with the Barnes Review, and that they were always very interested in knowing what was going on. And it really is nice that people noticed, but we do like to do this professionally, not Xerox the stuff on crooked, re-Xerox it a million times. We're trying to put out professional stuff. We're one of the few organizations left. There are some good ones. I always say Castle Hill Publishing, Ostara Publications, and then Arctos over in, I don't know where they're located. They were in India for a while, but it was a guy, Daniel Freiberg, a German, who puts out extremely high quality stuff. They're out there, pal, and you got to look for them, but they are few and far between, and we'll see how long it can go on like this. But while we're at it, we always figure, let's try to compete with the big boys. We don't consider our competition some guy in the basement. We consider our competition printing-wise and professionally, as far as our book and magazine production, as the finest magazines going out there to that. Any kind of contribution, any kind of purchase from the Barnes Review, of course, helps greatly and allows us to take that money and dump it right back into publishing the next book, of which we have several coming out. If you want to know, we got one on false flags by Clint Lacey. I mentioned him earlier. It's called a Beginner's Guide to False Flags, and it talks about all the number of events that happen in each of the run-ups to the wars we've been in. What was set up, what was fake, what was a Syrian chemical attack, so to speak, what was a 911, what was a Spanish terrorist blowing up the Maine, right?
Yeah.
All that stuff. And the other book is by Patrick Chenard, who's come on the radar recently, the SBLC and others, for his work on trying to figure out who the original Aryans were, where they came from, what their homeland was. I don't know why they got a bug in their rear ends about that particular topic. So these things take a while. It could probably be a year in production for either one of these books, with artwork and captions and proofing and editing and all that stuff. And well worth taking a look at the TBR bookstore to see what we have, because we also don't just publish our own stuff. We also buy stuff from book vendors that are smart enough to look through the smokescreen of history, to check out both sides of the story so they can get the full range of facts. And that's what the Barnes Review is in business for, as long as we can do it till they make it illegal. Just encourage people to go to this website and call us up at 1-877-773-9077 and just try it out. See what you think about it. Let us know.
Well, that was our interview with Paul Angel, the editor of the Barnes Review magazine. And unfortunately, that's about all the time we're going to have this week for TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. As always, we hope that you enjoy these broadcasts, and we invite you to come back again next week when we'll have another guest and another interview and some other exciting topics of conversation. Until then, I'd like to encourage you to go to the Barnes Review website, check it out. Go to the American Free Press website, check it out. Go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. You who emailed this week to say that our website was down, I apologize. We had accidentally let the domain name registration slip, and so we paid the fees and re-registered it this week for another 5 years, and so we should be good to go. Do invite you to check out our website. If you're not already a subscriber to the free Dixie Heritage newsletter, sign up, and when you do, I'll also send you absolutely free, no obligation, a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So until next week, God bless.